Does reducing saturated fat prevent heart disease? In our last episode, we looked at 2 meta-analyses to answer that question. But a meta-analysis is only as good as the trials behind it. So in this episode, John is taking a closer look at 3 key trials from those meta-analyses. And let's just say the details matter. We looked at these 2 meta-analyses. Today we will look at the RCTs that make them up. And in the end, based on everything we've looked at in these 2 episodes, you're going to dispense your conclusion.
Yeah, but only based on
these 2, because there exists way more meta-analyses and way more observational studies and other bodies of evidence that we're ignoring
at the moment
for now.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll take it.
And we'll get to that at some point, but just not now. Okay, before we start talking about the randomized controlled trials, I did just want to go over quickly again the one point that we kind of discussed a bit, which was having to do with the relative risk versus the absolute risk.
Yes.
Because I think that's, in all of these types of studies, that's always like a point of hang up for people, where some people point at the relative risk and they say, oh, it's a 40% reduction. And then you have other people arguing, but the baseline risk is so low, it doesn't matter. It's only like an absolute risk reduction of 1 or 2%, so it doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
So I just want to quickly go over the differences and like why we use one and why we use the other, and why don't we just always report both of them. So basically, relative risk and absolute risk reduction, they answer different questions. So, and it's kind of obvious what what the question they're answering is, that the relative risk asks like, what's the proportional or relative difference between groups? And the absolute risk reduction asks more, what was the absolute difference between groups over a specific time period? So it's just relative versus absolute, that kind of difference.
Could you give an example of both different metrics are talking about the same reduction?
Yeah, I mean, let's say you calculate a relative risk of 0.85. So that means you have your treatment and you have your control group. And in this instance where it's 0.85 is the relative risk, that means the treatment group has 15% less risk of whatever developing the outcome than the control group. And that's comparing one to the other. Like, basically it's just the amount of times it happens in the treatment group over the amount of times it happens in the control group, proportionally, so dividing by the total. So this is looking at one of the forest plots from Steen 2025, so one of the meta-analyses we were talking about. And this one is looking at non-fatal myocardial infarction. So let's say we want to calculate a relative risk or risk ratio, same thing, for just one of these trials. I don't want to do it for the overall, because then you have to weight the studies, and I don't want to go through all that calculation. But the numbers here represent the events in lower saturated fat, so that would be the intervention diet, compared to the events in the higher saturated fat, which is the control diet.
And in this case, events, it means
non-fatal myocardial infarction,
right? Okay.
Like heart attack. If you want to create this risk ratio for just the first one, all you do is 35 over 1018, and you divide that by 47 over 1015. That comes out to 0.74, which is 74%, which is what we get here.
Yeah.
So that's the relative risk or risk ratio.
And if you wanted to say that in English, it would be the lower saturated fat group had 26% less heart attacks, non-fatal, than the control group.
Correct.
Right. And the idea that we're trying to present is the 16% reduction could mean a lot or it could be nothing based on how big of a risk. Baseline.
Right. And if we just make a crude baseline risk, because the baseline risk would be only for this population in this, blah, 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 and over this time period. But it's basically just subtracting these two. So it would just be like a 1.19% reduction.
In absolute terms,
it would reduce the risk by 1.19%, which sounds a lot less impactful than the risk ratio of 26% reduction.
Right.
That, it's all context dependent for both of them, because...
To me, it's very baseline dependent, I would say.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely baseline dependent, for sure.
I'm sure I would need to look at both numbers in the end.
That's the point, really.
Yeah.
That you want to look at both when possible, and both need context.
Yeah.
Because whatever baseline you use to calculate the absolute risk reduction, how long is that over? If that's over 2 years, it's very different from over 20 years. Does all that make sense?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. And the only other thing that I wanted to point out was that meta-analyses usually look at a risk ratio or relative risk or the odds ratio or hazard ratios, and not specifically the absolute risk reduction, because that is much more tied to the baseline risk. And if you're pooling lots of different studies together, the baseline risk can be very different, and that could have more of an effect on the end comparison than the risk ratios would.
Okay.
It's not black and white, but like that's been the preferred way to do it. It's not like they're trying to cover up anything. That's just how it's been done.
Fair enough.
So basically the conclusion is that risk ratio definitely can appear to overstate the risks, but at the same time, absolute risk reduction can appear to minimize the real effect if it's a rare outcome or the follow-up is short, the time period you're looking at is short.
Yeah.
Okay. Having said that, I want to add some context in a baseline risk metric for what we've been discussing, this kind of cardiovascular events. From this article in JAMA 2012, it looked at estimating a lifetime risk for any total cardiovascular disease event. So that just includes fatal and non-fatal coronary heart disease, all forms of stroke, congestive heart failure, and other cardiovascular deaths, and it's from data in the US. And they found that actually the lifetime risk of the total CVD event for males is 60% and for females is 56%. So the baseline risk is, for this kind of thing, isn't, you wouldn't say it's low for the lifetime.
60% of males have a heart attack.
Not a heart attack, but some sort of
cardiovascular
disease type event. So we have been looking at kind of more specific events, but this is just in the same area. So I thought it would be informative to have at least some ballpark estimation. All right.
So if there was a 25% reduction, relative reduction from that 60%, that would be pretty big.
I would say that's significant, yeah. Okay, so back to the regularly scheduled program. Okay, so I think we just finished with this slide that just lists different meta-analyses and whether there's a benefit to reducing saturated fat. And some say there's a benefit, some say there's not. So there's a clear lack of consistency, and there are many reasons for that. And basically it comes down to the underlying trials that they include. They are somewhat different in the interventions. They're different in the comparisons, like the control group comparison. They're different in what nutrient is replaced by saturated fat. The populations are different, the duration, the settings, the outcomes, and even which version of the trials to include. Also, which outcomes they analyze. So some meta-analyses look at, like we saw, they look at fatal heart attack or versus non-fatal heart attack. And many of I think generally, if there's a benefit found, it's usually in some sort of subgroup or a specific replacement nutrient, like we saw in the STEAN.
Yeah.
There's definitely not a clear benefit in all of them.
I have a quick... generally speaking, cardiovascular disease starts at a certain age.
Yeah,
like it
usually takes a pretty long time to develop, yeah.
Are the studies that are included in these meta-analyses looking at those age groups, or are they just all over the place?
You mean...
I'm just wondering, how do they handle that? Like if...
Are you asking, are they targeting a specific age group that's at like a really high risk for a heart attack, like older?
Or maybe at least not including 20-year-olds or something.
Yeah, generally they wouldn't include very young people, especially if it's a randomized controlled trial, because they know they can't run it for like 50 years.
Right.
And if you included 20-year-olds, you'd probably have to run it that long. So most of them would, I think, at least like 40 years old. Generally a bit higher even.
Because I remember you showed me, I think it was this slide where it had all these differences between the studies. Mm-hmm. And I feel, like just intuitively, I feel the biggest indicator of somebody having a heart attack or predictor would be their age.
Yeah, that is a very strong risk for having a heart attack, yeah.
Like more than whether or not they're having saturated fat and whatnot. So shouldn't the meta-analyses be doing something to...
Are you talking about the meta-analysis or the randomized controlled trial?
The meta-analyses. Because like if the randomized controlled trials, I'm assuming they have different age groups, ranges.
Yeah.
And I think that would be... You would expect to see a different result based on the age group of the participants.
But remember that within the randomized controlled trials, they're randomized, so you would expect that the ages of the two groups would be similar overall.
Yes.
So in the meta-analysis, you could look at subgroups of specific ages and do an analysis on those, and some of them have done that.
Okay. So they like combine the subgroups across RCTs.
What do you mean they combine the subgroups?
They have the data of ages of the participant from the different studies. Mm-hmm. They made like one big study and combined them into, let's say, 40 to 50-year-olds from across the studies into one pool.
Yeah, they can. Yeah, they can do that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When we were looking at the forest plots and different studies had different results that could be explained by their difference in average age groups, even though they are randomized.
Yeah, I would say the baseline risk would be different in those, for sure.
Right.
But
right.
That's actually, you're explaining why we tend to look at risk ratio or relative risk.
Okay.
Instead of the baseline risk for meta-analyses.
Okay. Does it stop becoming an issue then?
I wouldn't say it totally stops becoming an issue, but it is a better way to compare different studies.
Okay, yeah, I see.
Any other questions? Or back?
No.
Okay. So
for now.
So this table just kind of summarizes each trial, when the trial was published, when the trial actually started, and then how many people were in it, the average duration, what kind of people were included in it, and what was the comparison diet versus the intervention. What two diets were being compared. And then if there was a change in saturated fat measured, and, you know, what hard outcomes were available, and a big thing that is a significant problem in the earlier trials is whether trans fat was an issue.
Right.
And that was definitely an issue in the earlier trials. And I've just got a major caveat, just like the main issues that I saw for these trials. But I think one of the main points in this table is if you look at the duration, a lot of them are really short, like 2 or 3 years.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, really optimistic if you think that reducing saturated fat a bit is going to show a clear effect after 2 years.
Yeah.
That's, I think, a bit probably wouldn't happen.
No.
But that's just a limitation of the trials we have. And this next slide is just looking at the specific trials that the Yamada meta-analysis included. So it's just from that previous slide. And this is just looking at the trials that Steen included.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so before we talk about a few of the specific trials, I wanted to just think about what would be the ideal randomized controlled trial on saturated fat reduction and determining if it's of benefit to cardiovascular disease or, heart disease. Because I think it just helps to see how difficult it can be to create these.
Yeah.
You'd have to think of how do you want to construct the randomized controlled trial to answer the question, and what specific question do we want to actually test? Because if you ask like the more general question, does reducing saturated fat reduce the risk of myocardial infarction? Okay, but what do you replace saturated fat with? Because if you don't replace saturated fat with anything, then it's also a reduction in calories, and that's another confounding factor.
If you're saying the word ideal, I would just take the pie chart of somebody's calories and take the saturated fats out and just expand everything else proportionally.
You still need a baseline diet, though, and it's still going to replace saturated fat with something.
Totally get that. I understand what I'm saying is not physically possible, but the operative word is ideal, and like ideally, you wouldn't change anything else because each person's diet is different.
Mm-hmm.
If you take a group of 1,000 people and then take their saturated fat out and give all of them something, then it's going to affect each person differently because each person was having a different diet.
Yeah, and this is another issue. Like, what that means, you're like controlling you're comparing many different types of diets to many other different types of diets.
Mm-hmm.
So that seems like it might be an issue. I mean, it's that, or you basically make the control group eat this diet and everybody eats the exact same diet. And then the intervention group, the treatment group, eats that diet, but a reduced saturated fat version of it, replacing it with whatever you want to replace it with.
Or you'd have many intervention groups, one with one for each replacement.
Yeah, I mean, it gets messy though. Yeah, but yeah, I mean that's the thing, that they had to think through all of these things, and it's not totally straightforward. What is the best way forward in creating a randomized controlled trial on this? And we haven't even talked about how do you check adherence. How do you make sure that people are following the diets?
Right. Because I see the paper and I'm like, oh, everything here is what it is.
Yeah.
But we don't see what's in the background, how they gathered the data and...
Right. I mean, that should be in the paper, of course.
Yeah, I get that, but most people don't look at that.
Yeah. And you would ideally want it blinded, but that's really difficult, of course.
Yeah.
I mean, just some general things that you'd want would be a really large trial, of course. You want a really long trial, like at least 10 years.
Yeah.
I would prefer one that, I mean, I could see 2 intervention groups maybe, but like I wouldn't want very many that look at specific replacements of saturated fat. So the problem is determining which exact food you would replace saturated fat with.
Yeah.
They have usually done something like oil, some sort of high polyunsaturated fat oil as the method of kind of reducing the saturated fat. So we're replacing saturated fat with some oil, and okay, that can happen. That is a way to test it, but then sometimes they're not how people would eat in the real world. So that's another issue. Ideally, you'd want the calories kept the same. You'd want to track other major factors in the different groups to make sure those, were the same over time.
One way to go about it, the whole what you replace it with in the ideal world, that would be kind of achievable, would just be to tell people reduce it and see what they do.
That kind of thing has been done maybe with a bit more control, like a bit more advice and coaching than just reduce it and see what happens. They would be more specific about how to reduce it.
Okay.
Like giving dietary advice, because I think many people wouldn't really be clear on what is saturated fat.
Yeah,
and
sure.
What foods contain it. So
sure. I mean something like that, not like
not just one statement like reduce it. There's your intervention. Yeah.
You don't even have to say what it is. Just reduce it and see
reduce it.
What people do.
We're making a trial, and you're in the group that's going to reduce it.
Good luck.
Bye. And then you'd have to measure everything they did, or get them to tell you what they did, and then you have other problems with, are they reporting it correctly? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So one I guess one point that I wanted to make with this was, like, the cleaner and more specific the trial is, the less it's like real life and how people usually eat in the real world, and probably the less ethical it is.
Yeah.
If you put people in a house and make them eat what you give them, and they can't leave or do any other eat food from anywhere else for 10 years or something, you wouldn't say that's ethical now. But then on the other side, the more realistic the diet is, like if you just give them advice and say, follow this advice to reduce saturated fat, then it's not as it's not as clean of an intervention than the other method, and it's harder to see if there's a real effect just on saturated fat.
If you were to rate all the RCTs based on how well they comply compared to this ideal that you made, would any of them come close?
Actually, the first one we'll talk about is the Minnesota Coronary Experiment.
Okay.
And I think that started out as the closest.
Okay.
Let's get into that one right now, because
Sure.
I think that started out as possibly becoming. The idea was that it would be the ideal randomized controlled trial, but there were problems with it. So first we'll talk about the Minnesota Coronary Experiment. So that was published in 1989, but the trial began in 1968, so it's a while ago. It was double-blinded, which I know, but they tried. I'll explain a bit more how they did that. And it was in institutions, so I think mostly mental institutions. I think it was 6 mental institutions and 1 nursing home of about 4,393 men and 4,664 women. And the participants, obviously for ethical reasons, could decline to enroll or discontinue being in the trial at any time. And the intervention was specifically a higher corn oil or corn oil margarine compared to like a regular institutional diet that was higher in saturated fat. And they looked at cholesterol, cardiovascular events, like cardiovascular death and total death. So like all-cause mortality.
Sounds promising.
Yeah, it was promising. And so these are just the percentages of types of fat in the diet. They compared basically the higher saturated fat one was 18% saturated fat. The lower saturated fat was 9% saturated fat.
Okay, wow.
So that's a pretty big difference for just saturated fat percentages.
Yeah.
And then because of that, polyunsaturated fat was 5% versus 15%. So
obviously
that's where most of the difference went. This is the big problem with the study. One of the big problems is that the actual duration of the trial, the average duration that people were on the diets was only 384 days, so just over a year, because they could leave whenever they wanted to. They even could leave the institutions and come back. So outside they'd eat something, they're not tracked. They're not being fed by the cafeteria in the institution, so they can eat whatever they want.
Right.
Anyway, overall, they really did not find any differences between the groups.
Did they try to filter it for people who stayed longer?
They did do some. I'm not sure. I think in the initial study they did do some of that, but it didn't reach significance because there were just too few people.
Mm-hmm.
Let me show.
Like how many people stayed more than 5 years?
Oh, no. Well, this was only meant to be 4.5 years, I think, total.
Okay.
So
did some people?
There were some people who stayed that long, yeah. So here, this chart, you're looking at the percent alive in the y-axis. So it, of course, starts at 100%.
Yeah.
And it's the number of years where they're tracking the people.
So this is everyone who stayed the 4.5 years?
Or died.
Okay. This is everyone who survived the 4.5 years or did not.
But like everybody's included in the beginning.
Yeah.
So whatever, it's like 4,000 per group here. So the dotted line is the control group. The solid line is the treatment group. Let's just look at the control group. So you would we start at 4,000 people, and at year 0, 4,000 people are alive. So the percent alive is 100.
Yeah.
Now, let's say at year 0.5,
500 people left.
500 people left. Now your denominator it becomes 3,500. And now you see how many of that 3,500 are alive,
Yeah.
which is maybe like 3,200 or 3,300, whatever, 94, whatever, 95% of 3,500 is.
Okay, I understand.
Does that make sense?
It does.
As you go in the number of years, the number of people is reduced, but also the numerator reflects that as well. So it's just a percentage. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
I guess the main idea of this chart is that the treatment versus control group is similar until you get past like 2 years or 1.5, and then it starts to split a little, but the people in it are just too few, so there's not a statistical significant difference.
But directionally, doesn't.
Directionally, actually, it favors the
the
higher saturated fat group, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there are some issues with that. So, okay, one thing you were probably wondering how they did a double-blind randomized controlled trial on food.
I was.
Well, they said here, so procurement of suitable foods for the treatment diet, which were yet palatable, stable, and indistinguishable from the corresponding component of the controlled diet, presented a great challenge. It was achieved through cooperation of study nutritionists, hospital dietitians, manufacturers of food products, and the Food Inspection Division of the Minnesota Department of Agriculture. Products that proved particularly useful were filled skim milk and ice cream, a whole egg substitute, soft margarine, whipped topping, filled cheese, low-fat ground beef with added vegetable oil, and filled sausage products. So yummy stuff.
I mean, a lot of that doesn't sound very healthy.
Yeah, exactly. And these products probably contained at least some amount of trans fats, because like margarine definitely at that time contained trans fats. So they just tried to make products that looked like the products in the control group.
Do we know for sure now that trans fats are worse than saturated fats?
We know for sure that trans fats are worse than saturated fat, yeah. Definitely.
I mean, I think that renders pretty much any study that may have included them
suspicious. Suspect. Yeah.
I mean, suspicious sounds like they had bad intentions.
Not purposefully, but like the conclusion is, I guess, not very reliable. You wouldn't take it as a on the face of it that
Yeah.
So we've talked about some of the problems already with this trial. I mean, they did really try to set it up like it was close to the ideal one. I think they really spent a lot of work trying to do that. But it was conducted in mental hospitals, so perhaps not very... now you wouldn't do that. You couldn't do that ethically. That wouldn't pass any of the review boards that look at this kind of thing. And there was a very high turnover, like I said, just 384 days on average on the diet. And the average stay in the mental hospitals and the nursing home was 292 days. and the exposure to the diets was intermittent, like people would leave and then come and eat what they want and then come back.
Okay.
And the diet change wasn't just reducing saturated fat, it was lower dietary cholesterol, and the replacement was pretty high in polyunsaturated fat, very high use of corn oil and corn oil margarine in the intervention diet. And they started out stratifying by smoking weight, ECG evidence of prior myocardial infarction, but later they only stratified by age and sex, so there might be some issues there. And the big thing is just the historical food environment with trans fats. I think that's one of the main problems with this study. And there was, along with that, there was a pretty big variability in the diet between the different institutions. So it wasn't like they were all following the same diet in each institution.
Right.
And some of the data was never recovered. There was kind of some incomplete reporting and recovered data issues that we'll get into in the next thing. So there was a kind of reevaluation of this trial and the results by this researcher named Ramsden. And his team found or recovered these study materials that were stored on magnetic tapes, like kind of, I guess, like in the basement of the researchers who did it.
Yeah,
I know it's a bit weird, but
yeah.
In this one, the main thing is they found more detailed results, but the main randomized comparison was the same. So it was just looking at more subgroups in the data, and it actually came mostly from somebody else's master's thesis that was written in 1981 for some reason. So I think Ramsden's main conclusion was just that the findings add to growing evidence that incomplete publication has contributed to the overestimation of the benefits of replacing saturated fat with vegetable oils rich in linoleic acid.
I mean, it seems fair, but what I'm not understanding is that after the researchers went through all the trouble of trying to set up the study properly, why would they not publish
everything they had?
Yeah.
I think it's just unclear. And we don't know, really.
Also, what prompted Ramsden to go looking in the first place?
The only thing I found about that was that he read the original study protocol and was like, they're missing some results that they said they were going to analyze in the original design. Where did they go? And then he started, I guess, contacting the original researchers and trying to figure out what happened. I don't know why I don't know.
And did he get a response as to why they did not publish?
I don't think so.
They told him, "Oh, just go look in the basement. They're on magnetic tapes."
Yeah, basically, I guess. I don't know. It's a bit strange, that whole thing. So
Ramsden didn't do any additional interpretation. He just found the missing data, just to be clear.
Yeah.
Other than what you showed.
Yeah, he just found some extra data on, like, some subgroups that they could have an analysis on, but not the original. It's not like he found more participants in the original randomized cohort.
Okay.
He just found extra data on participants. Yeah, he looked a lot on. There was more data on cholesterol for the participants in the trial, and he did a lot of analysis on that.
Okay, so he did more than just
He did more than just like present the master's thesis data or something. Yeah.
Okay.
But the main results from the original trial were still the same. That no significant difference, but some trending that it was actually negative for the saturated fat, the lower saturated fat group.
Right. Compared to the control that probably had trans fats.
Well, it's possible that both control and intervention had trans fats.
Okay.
The problem is we don't know how much in each exactly.
Fair.
Okay. The next trial, the next kind of big trial is this trial called the Sydney Diet Heart Study.
Out of curiosity, why did you pick these 3?
These are like 3 of the most famous randomized controlled trials on this.
Sure.
And there's like, if you want to go down the YouTube rabbit hole of people like arguing about all of these studies and what they show, and like this study's better because of this, and it shows that higher saturated fat is actually good for you, and then the other side will take, well, this one shows this, and I think it's better because of this, and it shows that lower saturated fat is good, and there's a lot of those debates. There's a lot of the debates about that. But okay, so the Sydney Diet Heart Study was published in 1978. Trial began in 1966. It was actually a secondary intervention trial, meaning that the participants already had heart disease, and it was 458 men, aged 30 to 59, and it kind of ranged from 2 to 7 years in the duration of the participants. And the intervention was this is actually more an advice trial. So they gave the treatment group advice to include more safflower oil and safflower margarine in their diet, compared to the usual diet. And the outcomes that they looked at was all-cause mortality, cardiovascular, and coronary heart disease mortality. So it was a kind of more, you could say it's like a more specific intervention. There's just high linoleic acids, safflower oil, not a general reduction in saturated fat.
Is trans fat an issue?
Trans fat in this one is a probable issue, but perhaps less than the other diet trial, but it's unclear. They did do some, control on tracking the diets, so they assessed the diets by interview and by food log multiple times, 3 times in the first year and twice yearly after that. And the results were basically that survival was slightly better in the second group, the high saturated fat group, like the previous trial as well.
Okay.
And we can show that this is a similar kind of graph to the other one. And you can see the same thing, like the percent survival on the y-axis and the years from entry, and the dotted line is the treatment group.
That seems a lot more significant.
It looks that way, yeah, but remember the numbers here are much lower. So we only started out with 221 people in the intervention group and 237 in the control group. So the numbers are smaller.
But proportionally...
No, yes, but you can see a difference here, yeah, for sure. They did say that survival was slightly better in the second group, but multivariate analysis showed that none of the dietary factors were significantly related to survival. I mean, the result is similar to the previous one where it looked a bit worse for the treatment group. Mm-hmm. But this study also has some problems, or some caveats, that it was in a secondary prevention population. Most people already had a heart attack and entered the study very close after they had a heart attack. So it's just something to be aware of, that in that time they're trying to change many things in their life, probably because they just had a heart attack. So
Okay.
it's just something to be aware of, that it's not like...
But randomization should take care of that?
Yeah, ideally it should. So like here, like smoking, you would expect them to maybe consider smoking less at this time, but this was back in the 60s, so it was probably less of a... There was still the time where many people smoked, and it wasn't seen as bad as it is now.
That just 70% of them smoked before they had the heart attack,
Mm-hmm.
and 38% of them smoked when they started this.
Yeah.
And what's the 47?
That's just people who smoke 20 cigarettes or more a day. Before was 47%, and then after
What?
I know, it's a lot of cigarettes. 50%
Half
of the people.
of them.
Yeah.
More than 20 cigarettes a day.
Yeah.
Then I can see why the fat isn't their biggest issue. It's like...
Yeah. So that was a that definitely would have a stronger effect on heart attacks than the little reduction in saturated fat.
It's like doing a study on a bunch of people who are being chased by lions. and then like... These guys in the control group
have this shoe, and these guys have this other shoe. Yeah, something like that. Okay. Yeah, along the same lines, there was some weight loss between the heart attack and study entry, which you would expect. The diet exposure was less tightly controlled. They did assess it, but it was more free living, and there was some control group contamination where the control group was also allowed polyunsaturated margarine instead of butter, or advised that. So the control group also kind of had some dietary advice, so might have changed a bit.
Okay.
The separation between the two groups in the diet was less than they intended, and there was a lot of within group variation and overlap in the diet between the two groups. So many people, like in the treatment group, their diet would look like maybe the average diet in the control group, and vice versa. This was back in the 60s, so late 60s, and trans fat definitely could be an issue in this.
Okay.
And it was a relatively small sample size, especially near the end, like pretty low numbers.
When did trans fats get banned?
Actually, not until I think the 2000s. Banned officially, but they were greatly reducing them before that. I think in the 90s, really.
So we probably had a bunch of it growing up.
I don't think you would have.
I come from a third world country.
Okay, well, there. I'm sure. Yeah, but I mean, I'm sure. I mean, yeah, I used to eat like microwave popcorn back in like the mid 80s. I'm sure that had some.
Yeah.
Also other crap in it too. So, I mean, what are you gonna do? And like, I'm sure in 50 years they'll find something we're eating now that's horrible that we shouldn't.
Yeah.
But yeah. And even the study said, in the study, the original study, it said the number of subjects and the duration of the study may have been insufficient. So there are just problems with this study as well.
Yeah.
And Ramsden did do another of his reevaluations. So
okay, what?
He also uncovered data from this one that was...
Is this his full-time job?
I think I mean, I don't know what his official job is. Clinical investigator is what he's called. So I guess that would be kind of.
He made that up.
He made it up. Maybe.
Like, who pays for that?
I think a lot of his work was funded by the NIH, the government here.
Okay.
So this one actually, he did find more data on the original, on the randomized cohorts based on different outcomes that weren't reported in the original study. So he found data on cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease mortality by group, and the original paper did not report that for some reason. And those actually also looked worse for the intervention diet, the lower saturated fat diet, and that was for these two. So basically, it's saying you have a 1.7 relative risk treatment versus control. So control is the more beneficial diet here. It also doesn't, if you're looking at the 95% confidence interval, it did not cross the 1, so it is significant with p-value 0.04. It is borderline, but still, that's definitely interesting findings.
Yeah.
That for some reason wasn't reported in the original study.
Huh. Where do I start? Why is it so common to not publish parts of this? Is this like common practice? I don't... Like, is he just going around turning stones and there happens to be unpublished data in everywhere he looks?
Is this common? I'd say it's not common practice. It might have been more common back then. I think now it's a bit more of a nuanced issue. Like, there's clearly studies that just aren't published because they find a null finding, and they just, those kinds of studies just aren't reported as much.
Sure.
But something like this, I don't think is that common anymore, because now we have a system where if you make a randomized controlled trial, you're supposed to register on a government website that states what you're going to study and how you're going to do it, like what outcomes you're going to report. And if you don't report those outcomes, it's in the study design, and everybody will know now. So back then it was not like that.
Okay.
So I don't think that issue happens so much anymore.
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely other issues, but yeah.
Okay. I have some thoughts, but I'll save it to the end.
All right. So Ramsden basically did show that the excess deaths in the treatment group were primarily from cardiovascular and coronary heart disease deaths, because those weren't reported before. And you definitely would say that's incomplete reporting for sure. I don't know why it happened. I don't think that's clear. Okay. So the next study is the LA Veterans Trial.
Hold on.
Okay.
Is Ramsden going to show up?
No, Ramsden doesn't show up anymore. Sorry. I know. I think this study, if you read the study, it reports a lot more things than the other studies.
Okay.
They're a lot longer. There's a lot of stuff that they report. So it's
just, since we're moving on from Ramsden, do you know if he ever published anything that shows the other direction? So, like, the study said something, but the stuff he uncovered turns out that favors lowering saturated fats.
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay.
Those are the only two that I'm aware of that he found this recovered data.
And then he retired.
My job is done.
He tipped his fedora.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I haven't looked into what he's doing lately.
Sure.
Okay, so the last trial that we'll talk about briefly is the LA Veterans trial, also published in the late 60s, but actually began in 1959. This was with 846 male veterans between the ages of 54 and 88. The duration also varied by entry. You could enter at any time. The diet intervention was same fat, but they substituted vegetable unsaturated fat for 2/3 of the animal fat.
Okay.
In the control diet. But this meant there was a high amount of linoleic acids, so that 38 grams of this linoleic acid in the intervention diet, and the control diet was just the regular institutional diet that people were eating, and that only contained about 10 grams of linoleic acid. So that's a pretty high amount, but that's what they did.
Okay.
And they looked at heart disease manifested by sudden death or a heart attack. They also looked at a few secondary outcomes. And their main results was that the primary endpoint was not statistically significant. That's the heart disease. But some combined endpoints favored the intervention or the lower saturated fat diet.
Okay.
But it was borderline significant, 0.04 p-value. So it is significant, but, and that was especially in the younger half of the cohort. So maybe that's where I don't know, maybe if you're older, the reduction in saturated fat doesn't matter as much because you're going to have an event due to some other, being older, just higher risk things. I don't know.
I mean, I would have expected it the other way.
Yeah, I'm just making up a story that
right.
might make sense. So fatal atherosclerotic events were lower in the intervention group, but total mortality was similar. So this one basically overall benefits a bit towards the lower saturated fat, but not like super clear.
Okay.
Similar problems. It was an institutional trial, but the diet control was just partial. When they looked at it, the adherence was like 50%, around 50% for each of the groups. It was meant to be an 8-year trial, but they had people coming in at, throughout the trial. So I couldn't find an average time on the trial.
Okay.
That didn't seem to be reported anywhere. One issue was that there were more withdrawals in the intervention group compared to the control group. So 117 people withdrew from the intervention group versus the control.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Maybe they didn't like the diet and then, just left. It was a mixed population. Some people had already had heart attacks or complications, but some didn't. The author stated that some of the participants may have been beyond the stage where prevention was likely from this intervention. And there is, of course, a possibility of trans fats in this time because they were using, these kinds of margarines and imitation ice cream and vegetable oils. So, it's that historical food environment back in that era.
Yeah.
And it was a relatively small sample size for the...
I don't get why these 3 studies are the popular ones, because they all have trans fat issues. And to me, that seems like an obvious disqualifier.
I think it's because you can choose your study and argue your case.
Okay.
Because they're not totally clear.
Okay.
You can choose this one if you want to argue.
Do the people who tout these studies say anything about the trans fat issue?
Yeah, I've seen some debates where people will, like Ramsden kind of did in his paper, they will argue that the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, either the authors were aware that trans fat was an issue at the time and they wouldn't have included any products with trans fat, or they argue that the difference between the trans fat in each group is not much, like the amounts in each group was about the same, so you can just like ignore that as a problem.
I can see the point of the second one a bit more than the first one. Seems like an interpretation, but I don't know.
Yeah, I agree, but I think it's still a problem either way.
Yeah,
because there's like, whatever you're doing, you kind of have to like build up evidence piece by piece and follow the trail and like say, okay,
I think
there's like a blog that like talks about like going back to like which manufacturer were they using, and then looking at like that product and finding like old labels of that product and seeing how
did they get anywhere?
It was still like speculation, but in the end, I think it wasn't. It was just.
How come nobody in their right mind has suggested, instead of reducing saturated fat in the intervention group, raising saturated fat in the intervention group?
So you want a controlled diet, like as they usually eat in the institution.
Correct.
And the intervention would be super high saturated fat. Like,
go nuts.
Eat more butter.
Yeah.
Like,
I feel that would answer the question.
I guess that's a different way to look at the question, but like, think about the ethics behind that. Most of these studies were most of the researchers doing these studies had the hypothesis that high saturated fat is bad for you.
But some did not.
Okay, some did not, of course, but they weren't making these studies. And if you're making a study and you think that saturated fat is bad for you and your intervention is increasing saturated fat, then that is at least ethically questionable. I would hope you would agree.
I do. But people of that persuasion who make the case that saturated fats aren't bad for you, couldn't they technically fund a study where they give a group a lot of saturated fat and see what happens?
Yeah. I mean, if it passed the ethics reviews, yeah. I'm not sure if it would. And these studies aren't small studies, they, at least if you're looking at, events like heart attack or something, they maybe could do there have been shorter term studies that look at like different surrogate markers, like raising cholesterol or inflammation. Those have been done. I'm not sure how many where the intervention would be just raise saturated fat. I'm not sure if it's mostly like reducing. I'm not sure. I would have to try and find some if they're out there. I don't know.
Would solve some problems.
Maybe. Okay, so I think the last 3 trials we talked about, the main issues were just trans fats. That was definitely a big issue, and the average time in the study, and also some adherence issues. And those are only 3 of the trials. These other trials have some similar issues. Many of them are actually later, so they don't have the trans fat issue, but then they have other issues that still make the results maybe not so certain as you would want them to be. I've just listed some of these here. A lot of the main thing is that they're just very short.
Okay.
Or very small. Or the difference in saturated fat is not much. Like it's 2 or 3%. And
I can see the duration being an issue.
Yeah.
As in a difficult one to solve.
Yeah. Especially for those hard outcomes. Definitely. I think these trials are, though they have their problems, they're not useless. Like they're still very interesting kind of historical works and shows like what they were trying to do back then to solve for this problem. And some of the, I guess, like the Minnesota Coronary Experiment was a really ambitious trial that you wish went better and didn't have some of the issues, but we won't be making another trial like that anytime soon.
But they didn't do, like, given the knowledge they had, they didn't do anything wrong.
No, I think they did very well given the knowledge they had. Yeah, they really tried. They aimed high, I can say. Yeah. Okay, now that we've got kind of, I think, a better understanding of the problems with the individual trials, at least overall, I want to now bring it back to analyzing these trials in a meta-analysis and some of the problems that come from that.
Yeah, I was going to ask, were these included in both meta-analyses?
Yes. Those 3 trials were included in both of the meta-analyses, but some of them weren't. It depended on which outcome they were looking at. I think some of them didn't have specific outcomes.
Were they weighted highly?
Let's talk about that. Actually, that is a big point that I wanted to talk about for this slide. So,
okay.
And this basically is talking about the overconfidence from the confidence interval precision. So generally when you weight a study in a meta-analysis, it gets higher weight if your confidence interval is smaller.
Okay.
So the confidence interval, for example, for a study is based on the event counts and the number of people in each group, like the treatment and control group. So if that's high, you're going to have a tighter confidence interval. Mm-hmm. And if you're using the full randomized cohort, like in the Minnesota Coronary Experiment, which was like 4,000 people, 4,000 people in each group, and that is one of the studies you use, but most of the other studies have only numbers in the hundreds. That study is going to be weighted much, much higher. And the trial might appear too precise just on its own and be kind of overweighted, because in that trial, we saw that the average duration on the diet was only a bit more than a year.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like there were 4,000 people in each group following the diet for the total duration, the 4.5 years.
Right.
So, yeah, that's basically the exact example here. So the Minnesota, just to clarify that example a bit more, it was described as a 4.5-year trial with about 4,500 people in each group, but there was high turnover, intermittent exposure, but most of the meta-analyses, of course, use the full numbers to calculate the confidence interval in the forest plots. And that will give the Minnesota a very tight confidence interval and a very high weight in the meta-analysis. And we can see that. So this is Yamada on all-cause mortality. And the Minnesota Coronary Experiment is this France. That's the author's name. But you can see the numbers here, 4,500, 4,500 in the experiment and control.
Yeah.
And you can see that gives a weight of about 45% to this study.
Yeah.
But those numbers are based on the full cohort.
Right.
But the average time on the diet was just about a year, and there was a lot of dropout from that. There were a lot of people who dropped out early, and so this
feels like a fundamental issue.
You could say that it's a fundamental issue with how these...
I mean, the weight calculation, it's inaccurate at best.
I don't know. Inaccurate is... I could see how you would describe it that way. But the problem is how else... If you were only using this method of doing a meta-analysis...
Well, use a different method.
Right. And that has other issues, because then you need the data reported in a much more granular way. Sometimes they only report the numbers at the end of the study. You don't have like per participant data available. And a lot of those things, that's what you'd need if you wanted like a much more nuanced and accurate analysis. And you'd need all the trials in the meta-analysis to do it that way.
Yeah.
So it's just, you can't easily fix it. It can be fixed by some. You just need a lot more detailed records that not many of the studies do not report those.
Yeah.
And you can do much more complex modeling of these things, of these outcomes, but if you don't have all the data, you can't do any sort of meta-analysis on it.
Yeah.
And it's not like there are many trials that you have to choose from anyway. So that's one issue, this overconfidence from the confidence interval precision. Another issue is kind of an overconfidence from event counts in like a shorter duration trial. So this is where, let's say you have a meta-analysis of 10 trials, that in those 10 trials they followed, overall 1,000 people for 1 year in each trial. So compare that to one trial where they follow 1,000 people over 10 years, which, okay, you calculate that, you have the same person years, but the issue is those 10 trials don't test a 10-year hypothesis. They don't answer a question that is only answered after 10 years.
Of course.
They just test a 1-year hypothesis 10 times. And if the event that you're interested in only happens after like 5 years, a meta-analysis on those trials would confidently conclude that there's no effect and would not be complete, it would be...
And I'm under the impression that something like heart attack would take several years to show.
Generally, it doesn't happen in 1 year or something. Yeah.
Okay.
And I would say, if you're talking about saturated fat, which you wouldn't expect like a humongous reduction, like 90% reduction or something that you'd see in, 1 year, clearly. If it takes years, you might not see it in many trials of shorter duration. So that's just talking about the duration problem in many of these trials. And so just general problems with meta-analyses is that meta-analyses are good to increase precision and power, but they can't fix bad studies. Like if the studies if the original studies are not designed well, they can't fix that.
Yeah, well, I was just about to say, I feel like a really good RCT would be way more telling than
a meta-analysis on 10 bad studies. Yeah.
Noise.
Yeah. And the issue is that they may make it appear like it's a more robust estimation, but if all the trials aren't that well done, then it can be a bit misleading there. And given the trial base that we have currently on reducing saturated fat and its impact on these hard outcomes, I don't think that more meta-analyses will help. So I advise maybe we don't need more meta-analyses.
Mm-hmm.
And even Steen in their meta-analysis says this trial base is unlikely to resolve extant debates about the relative benefits of saturated fatty acid reduction. So even in their own meta-analysis, they kind of admit that it's not going to end the debates on this. So
Right.
Okay, so just to restate our conclusion from the previous episode, I had combined the data from the two meta-analysis that we talked about, Yamada and Steen, into this one chart, and we just thought that there might be a pattern that emerges where you see in the more specific outcomes, like any coronary artery event or myocardial infarction, it seems like there's an emerging pattern where you see some benefits starting to emerge. But then as you go up to all-cause mortality, you don't see a benefit. It's kind of more diluted. So this was just an interpretation of the data that is a story, but I think it might be something, but it's low certainty, whatever you take from it.
Yeah.
So just to conclude everything, the randomized controlled trials that in the meta-analyses that we talked about are variable, have major problems in the design and conduct and applicability. And I think that makes the pooled evidence in the meta-analyses not very reliable and pretty uncertain. So I would say they don't unequivocally establish that reducing dietary saturated fat lowers the occurrence of these hard outcomes, or that it does not. I think you can't say either way for sure. And like I just said, there may be a signal, but it's not clear. I do think that, like I kind of alluded to before, is that telling a story and telling your conclusion based on one of these trials that you think is the best, I don't think that's reliable, because there's not one that's totally clean and perfectly done. And it's clear that there's been so much debate on them that there's not, there's not a strong conclusion either way, based on just this evidence set. And more meta-analyses probably won't help. So any conclusion is low certainty. Maybe even randomized controlled trials on this hypothesis are not the best thing in practice.
Yeah.
Maybe there's other methods that could be, how can I say, less susceptible to problems.
Yeah.
They sure have their own problems, but
I can see an observational study. Like I don't know, I haven't looked any up, but I can see how that would be solve a lot of the concerns that you brought up on these.
It could. It'll bring up more concerns, but
I'm sure it would. I
course.
Can't even think of what, but I'm sure you will tell me.
Definitely, yeah. Then the question is just what do we do? We don't have our like gold standard evidence that's clear from randomized controlled trials. But of course, like I said in the beginning, there's many other evidence types. We can look at mechanistic evidence. We can look at animal experiments. We can also look at human surrogate outcome markers. So not death, but things that happen before death that might imply that there is some negative health outcome further on down the line. And those could be randomized controlled trials because you might not need to wait 10 years for that.
Yeah.
And then, of course, like you said, there's the observational studies, which we will talk about. Okay, so I just made a final slide about more stepping back. What can we learn in general when we look at evidence from these types of studies and from randomized controlled trials? I think that it was clear that these diet trials, any trial where you're intervention is a changing of the diet. They're not just simple change one variable experiment, like give somebody a pill or somebody a placebo pill. It's never that simple.
Right.
Another point is that it's a general point in statistics that is often easy to overlook, that the failure to detect an effect is not the same as proving that there is no effect.
Yeah.
So I hope that was made clear in some of the examples we went over here.
To me, yes, but I can see how somebody just from surface level researching something might interpret that. Yeah,
and it's, I mean, even when I read a study, sometimes I forget that, like, it's not, just because they didn't find anything doesn't mean they proved that there is nothing.
Right.
It's good to remind yourself of this. Kind of related, whatever endpoint you choose, that strongly shapes the conclusion that you're going to make. So, like, all-cause mortality versus a more specific outcome, that will change the conclusion greatly. So you have to be really clear about which endpoint you choose and what does that mean exactly. You know, what are the benefits and negatives of choosing that outcome?
Yeah.
And like I said in the beginning, risk ratio or relative risk and absolute risk reduction, they both need context. You know, neither of them are free from needing to know about the context surrounding each metric. And significant versus non-significant definitely can overstate or oversimplify the interpretation, as we saw in the Yamada meta-analysis. And the big one here is meta-analyses are usually stronger evidence, but they can't fix poor studies. Should always, if you're really looking at a meta-analysis of something very important to you, at least open a few of the studies that are included in it to get at least an idea of what they look like, I would say.
Makes sense.
Okay.
I just wanted to say, I can see why the advocates for saturated fats perceive there to be a quote-unquote war on saturated fats.
Mm-hmm.
Certain studies have shown that reduction actually makes it worse, and there was some data that was obfuscated for whatever reason.
Not reported, yeah.
Yeah, but I can see how to them it appears like there's this agenda.
I can too, yeah. I mean, I can see, how can I say it? It's a deep rabbit hole that you can get sucked down in.
Yeah.
There's nothing there.
Okay.
Like, there's definitely something.
I'm looking forward to checking some observational studies or other bodies of evidence.
Yeah, this debate has been going on for a long time, and there's a lot of history behind it. So you can spend hours and hours talking about it and still trying to figure out how to give a good history of it without spending like 10 episodes on it, if you see what I mean.